Beatrice and I had built a simple, steady life together. We'd been married for 6 years, and while we didn't have much, we were content. I worked long days at a garage, fixing up everything from old pickup trucks to flashy cars passing through town. Beatrice worked evenings as a waitress at a bar called the Silver Fern, a dimly lit spot that catered to both regulars and the occasional traveler. We didn't have children, but that gave us time to focus on each other. I tried to be the best husband I could be. Beatrice never had to worry about fixing a leak or paying a bill late. I made sure her car was running smoothly, remembered her favorite snacks when I stopped by the store, and always made time to ask her about her day. She'd laugh sometimes, calling me the perfect husband, but I didn't think of it as anything special. Taking care of her just felt natural. Beatrice had a best friend, Julia, who was practically part of our household. Julia was vibrant and outgoing, with a sharp sense of humor that could brighten even the dullest of days. She and Beatrice had been close for years, long before I entered the picture. Julia often came over, sometimes for just a cup of coffee and a quick chat, other times for a whole evening. On those nights, the three of us would sit in the living room, watching whatever movie Beatrice and Julia picked while they swapped stories and laughed over inside jokes. I liked Julia well enough. She was easy to talk to, and her visits brought Beatrice joy, which was all that mattered to me. Some nights, if my day had been long, I'd doze off in the armchair while they stayed up talking and laughing softly. Julia worked as a receptionist at a dentist's office a few miles away. She hated the job, or so she said, calling it the daily grind of fake smiles and appointment rescheduling. But she had a knack for it, always knowing how to talk to people, put them at ease, and make them laugh even when they were dreading the dentist's chair. I often wondered why she stayed at the job if she disliked it so much, but she'd shrug it off, saying it paid the bills and left her evenings free to spend time with Beatrice. Our routine felt solid, even comforting. Beatrice's shifts at the Silver Fern didn't bother me. She came home late, sure, but I trusted her completely. She'd crawl into bed beside me, smelling faintly of beer and whatever perfume she'd worn that night, and I'd fall back asleep without a second thought. On quieter evenings, Beatrice and I would sit on the porch with a couple of beers, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She loved to talk about her plans for the future, small things like repainting the kitchen or planting a garden out back. I liked to listen, imagining the life we were building piece by piece. We didn't go out much, preferring to save money for a rainy day, but we had our traditions. Sunday mornings were for pancakes, a ritual we'd started in the first year of our marriage. Beatrice always insisted on adding blueberries, and I always made too many. We'd eat together, laughing as we tried to finish the stack before it went cold. Our little life was steady, filled with the kind of moments that didn't seem remarkable at the time, but made up the fabric of who we were. But life has a way of hiding fractures until they're too large to ignore. The morning began the way most of ours did. Beatrice woke up a little later than me since she didn't have to head into work until the evening. I made coffee while she shuffled around the kitchen in her slippers, hair a mess and eyes half closed. Mornings weren't her favorite time of day, but I always found her endearing in her sleepy state. She leaned against the counter as I fried a couple of eggs and toasted some bread. It wasn't much, but breakfast together was one of the few things we could share before I headed out for the day. She asked if I had any big plans at the garage, and I told her it was just another busy Tuesday. More cars in need of miracles. We ate quickly, and as I rinsed off the plates, Beatrice sipped her coffee, scrolling through a magazine she'd left on the table the night before. She reminded me that Julia might stop by later and joked about how Julia always seemed to raid the fridge. I chuckled, grabbing my jacket and keys. Beatrice gave me a kiss on the cheek as I headed out the door, the scent of her floral shampoo lingering for a moment. The drive to work was uneventful, the roads quiet as I listened to the hum of the engine. When I arrived at the garage, my coworker Jim greeted me with a grin. Jim was one of those guys who always seemed in a good mood, even when the job was tough. He said good morning and joked, asking if I was ready for another day in paradise, waving a wrench in the air. I laughed and set my stuff down, getting ready for the usual grind. It wasn't until lunch that I learned it was Mark's birthday. Mark was one of the senior guys at the garage, a no-nonsense type who rarely celebrated much. But the guys had convinced him to let loose a little, so we decided to hit a bar after work and grab some beers. Which bar? I asked casually, not thinking much of it. The Silver Fern, Jim replied, referring to the very place where Beatrice worked. It's close, and they've got good drinks. Plus, Mark likes it there. When the clock hit 6, we cleaned up and piled into our cars. There were 5 of us, me, Jim, Mark, and 2 younger guys, Chris and Danny, who were newer to the shop but fit in well enough. The drive to the Silver Fern was filled with laughter and stories, everyone in high spirits. When we arrived, the familiar glow of the neon sign felt almost comforting. It wasn't a fancy place, but it had character, the kind of bar where you could relax and not worry about appearances. Inside, the air was warm and alive with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. We found a booth near the back, squeezing in shoulder to shoulder as we settled in. Beatrice was busy, moving between tables with her usual grace, balancing trays and chatting with customers. She hadn't noticed me yet, her focus entirely on her work. Watching her like that, I felt a small swell of pride. She was good at what she did, always quick with a smile and a laugh, making people feel welcome. We ordered a round of beers and toasted to Mark, who waved us off with a grin and said we were making too much of a fuss. The conversation flowed easily. Talk about cars, old stories from the garage, and the occasional ribbing about who was the worst driver among us. I was halfway through my second beer when I noticed the group at the table next to us. There were 3 men, all regulars from the looks of it, leaning in close and talking quietly. At first, I didn't pay them much attention, but then I heard Beatrice's name. One of them remarked how she'd always been friendly, his tone laced with amusement. Another chimed in with a sly response, implying there was more to it than just being friendly. I felt myself tense up, my grip tightening around my glass as I focused on their conversation, trying to catch every word over the ambient noise. The first man mentioned seeing her with Arlo the other night, specifically in the staff room. His voice carried just enough to send a chill through me. Another man laughed quietly, confirming he had seen it too. He added that they looked like they were having a good time, noting how the door hadn't even been fully closed. There was a pause, and it seemed like he was about to say something more, but a third man's quiet laugh cut him off. Still, I didn't need any more details. The words staff room, Arlo, and having a real good time replayed in my head, leaving me frozen in place. After that evening at the Silver Fern, I couldn't shake the words I'd overheard. They replayed in my mind, twisting my thoughts in ways I couldn't control. I didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but something inside me had shifted. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before, not because Beatrice was acting strange, but because I couldn't help looking for cracks in the picture of our life. I began stopping by the bar more often after work, always pretending it was casual. I told myself it was nothing unusual, just a husband dropping by to see his wife. Beatrice never seemed fazed by my presence. She greeted me warmly, sometimes bringing me a drink herself or teasing me for showing up unannounced. But it wasn't her that I watched. It was Arlo. I noticed the way he interacted with her. He was always nearby, talking to her as she carried trays or leaning a little too close when they stood at the service station. At first, I told myself it was just camaraderie between coworkers, the kind of thing that happened in any job, but the way his eyes followed her, lingering longer than they should have, made me nervous. One night after work, instead of going inside, I parked across the street from the Silver Fern. The bar was bustling, the neon sign casting its glow over the parking lot as patrons came and went. I waited, watching as the hours dragged on, until finally, the lights inside dimmed, signaling closing time. A few moments later, the door opened, and staff began trickling out. Then I saw her. Beatrice stepped outside, laughing softly as Arlo followed close behind. She said something, and he gestured toward his car. My chest tightened as I watched her nod and follow him, climbing into the passenger seat of his old sedan. I didn't need to think twice. Starting my car, I kept a safe distance as they pulled out of the lot and drove down the quiet streets. I felt numb, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard it hurt. I didn't know where they were going, but deep down, I already knew. When they pulled into the parking lot of a cheap motel on the edge of town, the truth hit me like a blow to the chest. I parked at a distance, watching as they got out of the car and walked toward one of the rooms. Arlo opened the door, and Beatrice stepped inside without hesitation. I sat there, staring at that closed door, hoping for some explanation that wouldn't come. Minutes ticked by, and with each one, my anger built. 20 minutes later, I couldn't take it anymore. My feet moved on their own as I picked up a rock from the lot and hurled it at Arlo's windshield. The sharp crack of glass was followed by the shrill wail of the car alarm, cutting through the stillness of the night. I darted back to my car, parking it out of sight just as the motel door flew open. Arlo stumbled out, his pants unbuttoned and hanging loose, his shirt askew. He looked panicked, his eyes scanning the lot for the source of the noise. Behind him, Beatrice appeared in the doorway. She was clutching the edge of a robe hastily draped over her shoulders, the fabric hanging low enough to reveal far more than I wanted to see. My chest burned as I watched the scene unfold, every suspicion confirmed in an instant. Arlo ran to his car, swearing under his breath as he inspected the shattered windshield, while Beatrice stood frozen in the doorway, her expression unreadable from where I sat. I didn't need to hear their words or confront them to understand what had happened. It was all there, laid bare in front of me. Without waiting for them to notice me, I started my car and drove off into the night. The road blurred before me, my mind a storm of betrayal and anger. When I finally got home, the silence of the empty house pressed down on me like a weight. Beatrice wouldn't be back for hours, and I didn't know what I would say when she walked through the door. All I knew was that the life we had built together would never be the same. The days following the motel incident were a blur of anger and disbelief. I wasn't myself, I couldn't be. Every time I looked at Beatrice, I saw her standing in the doorway of the motel, her robe slipping off her shoulders. The betrayal burned through me like a fever, consuming every thought. But I didn't show it. Not yet. Outwardly, I went about life as usual, playing the part of the dutiful husband while the storm raged beneath the surface. Beatrice seemed none the wiser, laughing at small jokes, talking about her shifts at the bar as if nothing had happened. It was maddening, watching her act so normal, so unbothered, while I barely held myself together. One evening, after days of trying to process everything alone, I made a decision. I called Julia. She came over the next day, cheerful as always, but her smile faded the moment she saw my face. I told her I needed to talk, something serious, and she listened intently as I laid everything out. The overheard conversation at the bar, the motel, the shattered windshield, and the undeniable truth of what I had seen. Julia was stunned. Her mouth hung open as she tried to piece together my words, her usual sharp humor nowhere to be found. She shook her head, saying she hadn't known, hadn't even suspected. She kept repeating that Beatrice had everything, a loving husband, a stable life. I don't understand why she'd do this, she said, her voice heavy with disbelief. I couldn't understand it either. Julia's shock seemed genuine, and her reaction only deepened my confusion. For years, she and Beatrice had been inseparable. If Julia didn't know, was it possible this was something Beatrice had hidden from everyone? In the days that followed, Julia became my sounding board, offering words of support when I felt lost in my own anger. She told me I deserved better, that no one who loved someone could betray them so carelessly. Her kindness helped me steady myself, and with her encouragement, I decided I couldn't live with the silence any longer. One evening, when Beatrice came home from her shift, I sat her down in the living room. My heart was pounding, but my resolve was firm. I told her I knew everything, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. At first, she looked confused, her brows furrowing as she tilted her head. Then came the defensiveness. She asked what I was talking about, her tone sharp, almost dismissive, as if my words were absurd. I stayed calm, barely, and explained everything I had seen. The late-night rendezvous, the motel, Arlo. The way she froze, her face draining of color, told me I had struck the truth. But instead of confessing, she denied it. She forced a laugh, though her voice trembled as she spoke, denying everything. She claimed it was ridiculous and insisted I had it all wrong. According to her, she and Arlo had only been giving a coworker a ride or maybe discussing work. She assured me that whatever I thought had happened, it simply hadn't. Her words were hollow, her lie thin. I couldn't keep my anger contained any longer. I stood, my voice rising as I told her to stop lying, to stop insulting my intelligence. I had followed her, seen them enter the motel room, heard what happened inside. The air between us turned electric with tension. Beatrice's expression hardened, her initial shock giving way to something sharper, colder. She snapped back at me, her tone sharp and defiant. With an edge in her voice, she challenged me, asking if I was really willing to throw everything away over one mistake. She accused me of acting like I was perfect, as if I'd never done anything wrong. Her words hit like a slap, but they didn't deter me. I fired back at her, my voice filled with anger and disbelief. I demanded to know how she could reduce sneaking around with Arlo behind my back to a mistake. I pressed further, pointing out the lying and deceit, and asked if those were just mistakes as well. Beatrice's face twisted into something unrecognizable, her usual warmth replaced by venom. She called me paranoid, controlling, said I had no right to follow her or spy on her. The argument spiraled, emotions running high as years of trust unraveled in minutes. She accused me of suffocating her, of being too predictable, too boring. Each word cut deeper than the last, revealing a side of her I hadn't known existed, or maybe had refused to see. By the end of it, we were both left standing in the wreckage of our marriage, the love we'd shared buried under the weight of anger and betrayal. Beatrice crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing as she told me coldly that if I couldn't handle the truth, maybe I wasn't as strong as I thought. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I left the house after the argument, unable to stay in the same space as Beatrice. The air in the room had been suffocating, the weight of her cold, dismissive words pressing down on me until I couldn't bear it anymore. My feet carried me aimlessly through the streets of our small town, my mind churning with everything that had happened. Her lies, her anger, her accusations. They played on a loop in my head, twisting the knife of betrayal deeper with every step. I couldn't reconcile the woman I had married with the person I had argued with just hours ago. The Beatrice I knew was kind, thoughtful, and full of life. The Beatrice I had confronted was distant, sharp-edged, and unapologetic. I found myself standing outside Julia's house without even realizing I'd walked there. The porch light was on, its glow cutting through the night, and I hesitated for a moment before knocking. Julia opened the door quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern the moment she saw me. She invited me in without a word, guiding me to the couch and sitting beside me. I didn't know where to start, but the words came tumbling out anyway. I told her about the argument, about Beatrice's lies and the venom in her voice when she told me I wasn't enough. Julia listened intently, her brows furrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just let me speak until I had said everything. When I finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavy. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but full of emotion. She told me I didn't deserve this, that Beatrice had no right to treat me that way after everything I had done for her. She said she would talk to Beatrice herself, that this needed to be confronted head-on. I wasn't sure if it would help, but Julia's support was like a lifeline in a sea of anger and confusion. I thanked her, though the words felt hollow compared to the gratitude I felt for her unwavering presence. As I left Julia's house, I didn't feel ready to go home. The idea of walking through the door, of seeing Beatrice again, was unbearable. Instead, I drove to a bar on the edge of town, a place I hadn't visited in years. I sat at the far end of the counter, nursing drink after drink as the hours slipped by. The noise of the bar, the hum of conversations and clinking glasses, became a dull backdrop to my thoughts. I didn't talk to anyone, didn't even look up most of the time. By the time the bartender announced last call, the place had emptied out, and I realized how late it had become. The drive home was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to push the thoughts of Beatrice and Arlo out of my mind. The next morning, I woke up to find a message from Julia. She said she was going to talk to Beatrice, and that she would handle it delicately. I wasn't sure what to expect, but part of me hoped that Julia's intervention might make Beatrice realize the gravity of what she had done. Later that day, Julia called me again, her voice tight with frustration. She told me about her conversation with Beatrice, how she had tried to reason with her, to make her understand how much pain she had caused. But Beatrice hadn't been receptive. Julia described how Beatrice had bristled at her words, how her defensiveness had quickly turned into anger. Beatrice had accused Julia of meddling, of not understanding their relationship, and had told her to stay out of it. The argument had ended with Beatrice storming out of the room, leaving Julia shocked and hurt. Hearing this only deepened the pit in my stomach. If even Julia couldn't get through to her, what hope was there? That evening, I returned home. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Beatrice was in the kitchen, but we didn't speak. I walked past her without a word, heading to the bedroom where I shut the door and sat in the darkness, my thoughts spiraling. For the first time since this nightmare began, a new emotion took hold, one I hadn't felt before. It wasn't sadness or despair or even anger. It was something colder, more deliberate. I began to think about what came next. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Something else entirely. The next day passed in a fog. Beatrice moved around the house with the same aloofness I had become accustomed to. Her casual demeanor only fueled the cold determination building inside me. I didn't speak to her, and she didn't try to speak to me. The silence between us was heavy, but it didn't bother me anymore. I was already looking past it, beyond her. That evening, Beatrice prepared for her shift at the Silver Fern. She didn't ask where I'd be, and I didn't offer any information. I watched her leave, the door closing behind her with a faint click, and for the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not long after she left, Julia came by. She hadn't planned to visit. It was clear from her surprised expression when I opened the door, but seeing me standing there, she asked if I wanted company. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. We settled into the living room, Julia pulling her feet up onto the couch as I sat beside her. She started with her usual questions, asking how I was holding up, but there was something softer in her tone this time, less about probing for answers and more about simply being there for me. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted. Julia told me stories about her day at work, anecdotes meant to distract me from the heaviness in my mind. I found myself laughing at her dry humor, the way she described the chaos of her office or the quirks of her coworkers. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension in my chest eased. Julia had a way of making the room feel lighter, of drawing me out of the darkness I'd been stuck in. We opened a bottle of wine she'd brought, an impromptu gesture she joked was just in case. It wasn't long before the two of us were reminiscing, sharing memories of the past, times when everything felt simpler and clearer. At some point, the laughter gave way to a quieter, more reflective mood. Julia looked at me with an intensity one wasn't prepared for, her voice soft as she told me I deserved better than the life Beatrice had given me. Her words struck a chord I hadn't expected, and I found myself opening up more than I ever had. I told her about the betrayal, the lies, and the arguments. She listened intently, her hand resting lightly on my arm, a gesture that felt both comforting and grounding. The space between us seemed to shrink as the night wore on. It wasn't planned, wasn't something I even thought was possible until it happened. One moment, we were talking, her hand brushing mine as she reached for her glass, and the next, the distance was gone. I don't know who leaned in first. The kiss was tentative at first, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened, the emotions between us spilling over. What followed was a blur of closeness and warmth, a moment that felt entirely separate from the pain and anger that had consumed me for so long. Afterward, we lay in the quiet of the bedroom, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of the hallway light. Julia rested her head on my chest, her breathing steady as the weight of what had just happened began to settle over us. It wasn't guilt or regret that I felt, but clarity. The warmth I felt beside Julia was something I hadn't experienced in years, a stark contrast to the cold detachment that had come to define my relationship with Beatrice. But the stillness didn't last long. The sound of the front door opening cut through the air like a knife. My body tensed as I heard Beatrice's footsteps echo down the hall, each one louder and more deliberate than the last. When the bedroom door opened, the shock on her face was immediate and visceral. Her scream filled the room, a mix of fury and disbelief. She shouted, her words sharp and cutting, demanding to know how I could do this to her. I didn't flinch, didn't scramble for an explanation. I sat up, meeting her gaze with a calmness that only seemed to enrage her further. I responded with an even, almost cold tone, asking how she could turn this on me. I reminded her of everything she had done, all the lies she had told, and let my words hang in the air like a challenge. Her voice rose, accusations and insults tumbling over each other as she demanded answers, trying to regain control of a situation that was already slipping away from her. But I didn't care. Not anymore. I'm done, I said simply. I'm filing for divorce. Beatrice's reaction was explosive. She screamed that I couldn't do this to her, that I had no right to walk away, as if she were still entitled to the loyalty she had so carelessly thrown away. Julia stood, quietly gathering her things, her expression unreadable as Beatrice's words filled the room. I packed a bag quickly, not bothering to respond to Beatrice's tirade. There was nothing left to say. As Julia and I walked out of the house together, Beatrice's screams followed us, her anger a final echo of a marriage that had already ended long before that night. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. The divorce was swift. Beatrice's initial protests and outbursts faded quickly once the legal process began, replaced by a simmering resentment that became her constant demeanor. I left the house to her. It wasn't worth fighting over, but the court awarded me a fair share of its value, enough to start fresh. Beatrice, of course, wasn't happy about it. She accused me of robbing her, of taking what was hers, as if the betrayal and lies she had spun hadn't cost me more. Her anger didn't faze me anymore. It felt distant, like background noise in a life I was ready to leave behind. After the papers were signed, I moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Julia visited often, helping me settle in and making the space feel less empty. What had started as a moment of closeness that night had grown into something more, a genuine, mutual care that felt like a lifeline. Julia and I began seeing each other regularly, and for the first time in years, I felt happy, truly happy. She took care of me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was the small things. The way she'd bring me coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. The way she'd listen, really listen, when I talked about my day or the lingering emotions from everything that had happened. I found myself wanting to take care of her, too. I'd surprise her with little things, a favorite snack, flowers just because, and the way her face lit up reminded me how much I'd missed giving and receiving love without conditions or complications. Beatrice stayed in the house, her bitterness evident whenever we had to speak, which thankfully was rare. I didn't hate her anymore. Anger had burned itself out long ago, but there was no part of me that missed what we had. As weeks turned into months, my life began to feel like it was my own again. The garage kept me busy, and Julia became a constant source of light, someone who reminded me that even after the worst storms, there was a chance to rebuild. We didn't rush into anything, but the connection we shared felt natural, easy in a way that I hadn't thought possible. Together, we found joy in the simple things. Dinners at home, walks in the park, late-night conversations that stretched until morning. Looking back, I realized that losing Beatrice wasn't the end of my happiness. It was the beginning of something better,